some other characters. This is a man of the cloth.
Yes, this is the saint of the gold fields, really. It's Father Pat, Henry Urban. He was called Father Pat. He's riding this old horse called Tom here. And he is armed, of course. And this is just prior to his death. He was considered by many people to he was the miners' priest. He was well loved by all the miners, whether or not they were religiously inclined.
What endeared them to him?
Well, he was a very strange guy. He was an Irishman. He was had a quick temper, flash temper, and occasionally would come to blows with individuals who perhaps didn't agree with his particular philosophy.
But still, that endeared him. I mean, he was straightforward. He was honest, was he?
Very definitely.
He didn't line his pockets with their gold?
No, very, very fine man.
And why was he armed? I mean, did all men have to be armed at that time?
Well, and probably in Father Pat's case, he didn't have to be armed. He'd be hunting meat and feeding himself as he went along.
The next shot is probably one of the most recognizable characters in British Columbia history, who actually came from around this area.
Oh, sure he did. Yeah, this is Bill Miner, and his
that
brother
wasn't his real name, I understand.
Well, no, it isn't, and it's debatable, but he was a Georgian, and his brother, so-called brother, Jack Budd, was in a ranch just outside of Princeton, and Miner knew Granite Creek, had been there, and frequented the area, and eventually got caught for the robbery of ducks, and went to prison for some years until he escaped. And this was the guy who originated the phrase, hands up.
Now, that shot there, would that have been just a little postcard or a photograph, a family photo, or would that be a mug shot from his...
That's a mug shot after the hold-up at Ducks. And, but you can see that a very interesting man, you see. He started robbing stagecoaches when he was 16. And he jumped onto a stagecoach, and before that time there were several phrases. But he couldn't think of what to say, so he said, hands up. And much to his amazement, the driver of the stage put his hands up, and a new phrase was coined.
And was he a bad man? I mean, there's a Robin Hood theory about him, too.
Yeah, there is. But I think I talked to people who knew him, who are now deceased, and they kind of liked him. He was very courtly individual, well-spoken, soft-spoken, never killed a man in his life that they know of, wounded several, and amassed a considerable amount of money over almost half a century of robbing stagecoaches and then trains.
Yeah. The leg irons, which we've already seen on a couple of shots here, do you think Bill ever wore these?
I would doubt it whether he ever wore those, although those came out of the Princeton Granite Creek area, and but they're typical of the leg irons of the time, and you did not walk very rapidly. You certainly didn't run with those and when you were ironed and cuffed.
They look substantial enough. Did anybody ever get away after these had been put on?
I can only think of one case in that immediate area where a guy got away with. He was cuffed and ironed and managed to throw himself through the back window of a train, landed on his feet on the tracks, hobbled off into the bush, and knew somebody in the immediate area, and they managed to sever the irons from him. Eventually he was recaptured, but not at that particular time.
How did you come to acquire these fine set of leg irons?
Well, they're out of the Canada West collection, and I collected them many years ago, probably about 25 years ago, Mike.
Very wise, judicious buy back then.
Yeah, I guess it was. It's part of our history.
Right. Additional material. We've talked about a little bit about businessmen when we looked at Mr. Dewdney, but there are other businessmen who made their living at this time. This is one of the buildings, last surviving buildings of Granite Creek. Is it still standing today?
Well, actually, the wall closest to us, which is on the right-hand side, has just caved in last year, unfortunately. This is the old Cook general store in Granite, and it stood for many, many years, and it's a shame. It could probably still be resurrected, but it's not in very good condition just now.
Must have been quite a structure. The 2 stories, obviously, so an architectural feat for a log building.
Oh, yeah, he bought platinum and gold.
F.P. Cook.
Yeah.
This building was born from an apparent additional find.
Yes, a later operation where they felt the old Swan Channel, felt they had got another run of Granite Creek, and so they had a mining operation just west of Granite Creek itself. Didn't last that long, didn't make much money.
This shot was taken in, what, the early 70s?
That was taken in the early 70s. That building is gone now, Mike, unfortunately.
Would just fall down or torn
just fell down. Yeah.
This is still around, though, I think.
Yeah, this building is in Granite City itself, and it's still there, and typical of the log construction of most of the buildings in Granite.
Now, there's not standing headroom there. They dug the floor out on the inside.
That's right, they did.
Saving on logs there. And is pretty well all these buildings still there for Granite today?
Just about all of them. One has disappeared that shows, but this is typical of the flat upon which Granite stood, and of course nobody lives in the center of town itself. It's all vacant. It is truly a ghost town.
Now, the hillsides that you see going up behind there, anything special about that country up there?
Well, yeah, there's an old town called Blakeburn, which is way up in the hills, and the old Blakeburn accident took place there. But that's a different story in a later era, really.
Okay, we do have a couple of really remarkable treasure stories to tell here, and so what we'll do is take a break, come back in a second, and look at treasure stories from Granite City. One treasure story, I like the treasure story of the platinum cash, but
yeah.
Cold hard cash is kind of an interesting story as well.
Yeah, this one concerns banknotes, actually, old banknotes. Yeah. And in 1964, 1964, a man called Don Coombs came into Granite, kind of down on his luck, had a wife and a number of small children, and came onto the flat deciding to rework some of the old diggings, and saw a cabin on the flat, and this is the cabin pictured here, and decided he would make this a temporary home. And as he went into the cabin, he began to clean it out, Mike. And when he cleaned it out, he was throwing small pieces of paper out the door that were wrapped in twine. They're actually kind of an oil paper wrapped in fishing twine. And threw a number of these packages out the door. Finally, his curiosity got the better of him, undid the fishing twine, looked inside, and there were some old banknotes. And I mean old banknotes, 1890s, Bank of Montreal, Bank of Nova Scotia, all the old defunct banks of Canada. And there were $5 bills and $10 bills and ones and twos. He was astonished. Looked through all through the cabin, under the oil paper, under the table, and all over the place. Came up with $1,198 in old bills. Now, he wasn't sure at that time, this is 20-odd years ago, yeah, whether they were worth anything. So he took them down to the Bank of Commerce in Princeton, and he presented them to the manager, and the manager looked them up in his book at that time and said, yes, this is worth face value, this is worth face value, and so on. And he had $1,198 in face value, traded the bills in for that sum, and surprisingly enough, the bank manager didn't know how valuable they were either, because they're very valuable collector's items.
So weren't numismatists around at the time? I mean, you collect coins and face value. What do you think they'd have been worth as a collector's item or historic value?
Even at that time, probably somewhat over $10,000. $10,000. And more now, depending upon the date, depending upon the bank, and depending upon the denomination and the condition of the bills. And these bills actually were sent on to Penticton. And I was informed by some of the bank clerks in Penticton that they had some old bills in from Princeton. And I said, oh, yeah, I'd like some of those. Where'd they come from? They said, oh, I don't know, some old prospector, I guess. So I bought a few of these bills at face value. And eventually, I traded them at face value again to a collector in the Okanagan, and unwittingly didn't know that they'd come from the old treasure shack. And, of course, I learned about this many years later.
And so kicked yourself for trading them away?
Well, yes, because they had historic value.
Are they at all intact at this stage?
Well, they're pretty well spread out, except for the ones I had, and they're in the hands of a collector in the Okanagan.
Tremendous. There are still riches in this area, too. I mean, as much as the Chinese went through the country and mined it, followed by the white prospectors who came through and mined it, and there were how many gold rushes here? Because this was not just one run.
Well, there was the original find, which was 1858 or 59, and then the Chinese worked it for 25 years. Then there was the Granite Creek rush, and then in the 1890s, considerable activity until Granite itself was burned in 1907, heavily burned, so that not many of the buildings survived. But then the Depression of the 1930s, and now some miners going back into this area to rework some of the benches and looking for old channels.
And like the man who went in the 60s to look for some treasure, I mean, just down on his luck, and your